Starting about a year or so ago, some of our leading corporates began to lock onto these climate issues far more strongly. What do you think were some of the factors that got them to engage more sharply?
In part, it was the success of the Paris Agreement and a sense that climate change policy at the international level was going in the right direction. But also, I think there have been some really interesting developments around corporate reporting. And overseas, in the UK, for example, it's mandatory to report on environmental risks. And so standards have been beginning to be developed and established overseas, and leading corporates in New Zealand have been taking notice of that and thinking about what it might look like in New Zealand and preparing for it.
Then looking ahead 10 years from now, what do you think might be happening over that period of time?
Over the next 10 years, I think we will see a Zero Carbon Act, and we will see an independent climate commission, and we will see a lot more certainty for business through five-yearly carbon budgets, and businesses being able to plan knowing that there's a legislated scheme there. But what I think is also key is the convergence between what the government is doing at that level with legislation and the corporate reporting that I was just talking about, corporate environmental reporting, because that will definitely grow over the next 10 years. And so even when policy has its ups and downs, as it has had in New Zealand, once those corporate guidelines and requirements are established for reporting, then investors will see that and the markets will take notice. And also what businesses measure, of course, they then manage, and that will create its own impetus. And so those two things will converge, and we will see much more active management and over the next 10 years of the issue by business.
Would you care to nominate some New Zealand companies that you consider are on the leading edge of these issues?
A couple of companies that come to mind would be Z Energy and Air New Zealand. Z Energy is right in the midst of the fossil fuel issue, but is very open about the fact that that's going to be challenging in the future. And so, for example, has invested in a biodiesel plant here in Auckland, in Wiri. And so it is imagining what the future might look like. Air New Zealand has been in this area for a long time, from very early on. And so you see it in a range of ways in its fleet, and the way it flies its planes, in its own experimenting with synthetic fuel, and it has invested in forestry, and it's engaged with its customers on this. And what you notice about the leading corporates is that they're very open about their sustainability policy, about what they're doing. So that in turn lifts expectations, no doubt, but is a virtuous cycle.
Every country has its own particular challenges, and ours, of course, is our primary sector, because animal emissions are 49% of our total. What sort of response are you recommending to the primary sector for engaging fully in this transition?
I think for farmers, a very natural option is to think about forestry, because that is in the primary sector. They have land options available to them, they have water and erosion issues in some cases, and they certainly, it's not hard for farmers, even if their own land doesn't lend itself to forestry, to be able to think in terms of forestry land that they could acquire or undertake forestry activities on. It's after all in the primary sector. So, and forestry is where the answer lies to many of the questions around climate change in New Zealand. So I feel it's more intuitive for farmers, the agriculture sector, to be thinking about forestry, the crucial offset for it, and how it could invest in that area. And it would be easier for them to bring their skills to bear with land-based activity in forestry. So that could well be where the solution lies for farmers.
The government is planning to bring agriculture into the ETS, but only initially to meet 5% of their total obligations. Is that too gentle a start, or is there a case for mapping out a deeper engagement by the sector in these issues?
I think that's a valid place to start. It is still acknowledged that the solutions to methane emissions aren't there, so it's much more about offsets in the meantime. And the rest of the economy has had the opportunity to learn by doing with the emissions trading scheme. Agriculture, farmers haven't been in the scheme, yet. So they need their opportunity to learn by doing, and they may well find that they're very adept and that the forestry opportunities become very clear to them. What's really key is having a pathway that gives them certainty. So it's not about where they start or what that initial amount is, but where the end point is, and understanding the pathway to get there. And if they understand that and it's a time frame that they can work within, then they'll be in a position to adapt.
The government's got a busy time ahead to design a climate commission and draw up a zero carbon act. What would be the very main elements you think are must-haves in those? And what do you think are the things that they need to avoid that we can see from experience overseas would be undesirable?
One thing is that we need to keep it simple. The emissions trading scheme was extremely complex, and that has created its own issues over time. Heavily engineered, needed to be, because emissions trading and international carbon trading is inherently complex, but by creating something very complex there can be unintended consequences. Fortunately, establishing a target for emissions reductions in 2050 is a fairly binary thing, and a climate commission is simply establishing an organisation. I think it's important for it to have independence, sufficient separation from Parliament, that it is not influenced by the government of the day. If it comes up with its own recommendations for emissions budgets based on good science and independent expert input, then it will be there for all to see, and it will be credible. But it's crucial that it has that credibility through independence and the expertise that is able to access. Then it can leave it to the government of the day to implement the policies that are going to be needed to meet those budgets. And then the government itself of the day will be accountable if that target is not being met. So that degree of separation will be an important aspect of the Climate Commission and a Zero Carbon Act, and the mechanism around that being effective.
It's very hard to compare one country with another because each has its own challenges. But roughly speaking, where would you see New Zealand fitting in a continuum of leading countries to laggard countries on these climate issues?
New Zealand would have, in some quarters, prided itself on being near the front of the pack at the time that it brought in its emissions trading scheme, because in other countries, such schemes have focused much more narrowly on individual high-emitting sectors, whereas New Zealand's scheme is economy-wide, covering all sectors. So New Zealand has a deep understanding of emissions policy and emissions mechanisms and levers that can be applied. So it is very advanced in that sense, but where it is lagging is around the corporate reporting and what the market itself is doing. So the story is mixed in New Zealand, but the crucial thing is that we have learned by doing through the emissions trading scheme over the last 10 years, and being a small country, we can work out what are the levers to pull to make a scheme or a policy effective, and then we can, once we've identified those, move relatively quickly to the desired solution.
And it's very clear from your own career that you locked onto these climate issues at a very early age, starting with going to London to do a master's in the early 90s, and then starting your career with Citibank in derivatives as a lawyer in the early days of carbon markets. What was it that got you so locked on to these opportunities so early in your career?
In those early years, and when I was making choices about my future career, having worked in litigation, we were always fixing problems that had already occurred and trying to make the best of the situation. I made a decision I wanted to focus more on the future, and looking at my working life, climate change seemed like one of those existential issues, and so that's what I chose to focus on. Since then, it's been full of ups and downs in terms of the policy development, but I too have learned a lot along the way from those, and so that puts me in a position to contribute further. One thing, we've worked with the government, we've worked in the development of the emissions trading scheme and the design of it, and we've worked on the private sector side, so we've seen both perspectives, And that really helps, having had that experience, to think about where the balance lies to create the settings in the right way going forward.